Spiritual Theology, Part 10. Preferring Suffering to Pleasure. However contrary this may seem to our weak nature, the saints succeeded in reaching these heights. A moment arrived in which they felt an instinctive horror for anything that would satisfy their tastes and comfort. When everything went badly with them and the whole world persecuted and calumniated them, they rejoiced and gave thanks to God. If others applauded or praised them, they trembled as if God had permitted those things as punishment for their sins. They hardly took any account of themselves at all, or of the heroism that such an attitude presupposes. They were so familiar with suffering that it seemed to them the most natural thing in the world was to endure pain. St. John of the Cross has given us a rule for reaching this state. His words seem severe and are a torment to sensual ears, but it is only at this price that one can attain the treasure of sanctity. To endeavor always to incline oneself, not to that which is easier, but to that which is more difficult. Not to say which is tasty, but to which is more bitter. Not to that which is more pleasing, but to that which is less pleasing. Not to that which gives rest, but to that which demands effort. Not to that which is a consolation, but to that which is a source of sorrow. Not to that which is more, but to that which is less. Not to the lofty and precious, but the lowly and despicable. Not to that which is to be something, but to that which is to be nothing. Not seeking the best in temporary things, but the worst, and to desire to enter in all nakedness and emptiness and poverty through Christ in whatever there is in the world. Offering oneself as victim. It would seem that it is impossible to go further in love of the cross than to prefer sorrow to pleasure. Nevertheless, there is still another more perfect degree in the love of suffering, the act of offering oneself as a victim of expiation for the sins of the world. At the very outset, we must insist that this sublime act is completely above the ordinary way of grace. It would be a terrible presumption for a beginner or an imperfectly purified soul to place itself in this state. To be called a victim is easy, and it pleases self-love. But truly, to be a victim demands a purity, a detachment from creatures, and a heroic abandonment to all kinds of suffering, to humiliation, to ineffable obscurity, that I would consider it either foolish or miraculous if one who is at the beginning of the spiritual life should attempt to do that which the Divine Master did not do except by degrees. The theological basis of offering oneself as a victim of expiation for the salvation of souls, or for any other supernatural motive, such as reparation for the glory of God, liberating souls in purgatory, attracting the divine mercy to the church, the priesthood, one's country, or a particular soul, is the supernatural solidarity established by God among the members of his mystical body of Christ, whether actual or potential. Presupposing the solidarity of Christ that is common to all Christians, and God selects by certain holy souls, particularly those who had offered themselves knowingly for this work. so that by their merits and sacrifices they may contribute to the application of the merits of the redemption by Christ. A typical example of this can be found in St. Catherine of Siena, whose most ardent desire was to give her life for the Church. "The only cause of my death," said the saint, "is my zeal for the Church of God, which devours and consumes me. Accept, O Lord, the sacrifices of my life on the mystical body of thy holy Church." She was also a victim soul for particular individuals. Other examples of victim souls are Saint Therese of Lisieux, Saint Gemma Galgani, and Sister Elizabeth of the Trinity. In practice, the offering of oneself as a victim for souls should never be permitted except to souls of whom the Holy Spirit asks it with a persistent and irresistible motion of grace. It should be noted that, rather than contributing to the sanctification of the individual, although it does add something, this particular act is ordained to the spiritual benefit of others. The soul that would give itself in this way for the salvation of others must be itself be intimately united with God and must travel a long road towards its own perfection and charity. It must be a soul well schooled in suffering, and even have a thirst for suffering. Under these conditions, the spiritual director could prudently permit a soul to make this oblation as a victim soul. Then, if God accepts the offering, soul can become a faithful reproduction of the divine's martyr of charity. 8. Progressive purgation. In order to arrive at the intimate union with God in which this sanctity consists, it is not sufficient to win a victory against sin and all its principal allies, the world, the flesh, and the devil. It is also necessary to achieve an intense and profound purification of all the faculties and powers of soul and body. The reason is obvious. When a soul begins to journey to holiness, it is already in possession of sanctifying grace, without which it could not even begin. The soul has been endowed, together with grace, with the infused virtues and the gifts of the Holy Spirit. The Trinity dwells in the soul as in a living temple, and the grace of adoption makes the soul. But in spite of all these graces, the soul is laden with imperfections and defects. Grace does not of itself exclude anything more than mortal sin. It just leaves us with all the natural and acquired imperfections we had at the moment of our justification. The soul remains subject to every kind of temptation, evil inclination, and acquired evil habits. The practice of virtue is therefore difficult and arduous. The infused virtues, received with sanctifying grace, give the soul the power to perform the corresponding acts, but they do not automatically rid the soul of its acquired evil habits or of its natural indispositions to the practice of virtue. These are destroyed only by practice of the acquired virtues. Then, when the supernatural habit no longer finds any resistance or obstacle to its exercise by reason of a contrary habit, the virtuous act will be produced with facility and delight. The reason for the resistance and rebellion of our nature against virtue must be sought ultimately in original sin. That first sin caused a weakening of the natural association to good, and that human nature had in its state of original justice. From this follows the necessity of a profound purification of the faculties in which evil habits and vicious inclinations are rooted. In the process of purification, God reserves to himself the better part, passive purifications. But with the help of grace, we must do all in our power to rid ourselves of all the impediments to the divine action. The purpose of the active purification of the external senses is to restrain their excesses and to subject them to the rule of reason illumined by faith. A disciplined human body is an excellent instrument for sanctification, but in the present state of fallen nature, it has an almost irresistible tendency to anything that can give pleasure to the senses. If it is not subjected, it becomes indomitable, and its demands become more and more excessive until it constitutes an obstacle comparable with the spiritual perfection in the soul. St. Paul speaks of the necessity of mortifying the body in order to be liberated from its tyranny and to assure one's own salvation. I treat my body hard and make it obey me, for, having been an announcer myself, I should not want to be disqualified. 1 Corinthians 9:27. In another place he says, "Those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified their flesh with its passions and desires." Galatians 5:24. St. John of the Cross repeats Paul's teachings and gives a reason that is intimately connected with the divine union in which the soul travels. It is necessary to assume one truth, which is at the sense of the lower part of man, which is that whereof we are treating is not and cannot be capable of knowing or comprehending God as God is, so that the eye cannot see him or anything that is like him, neither can the ear hear his voice or any sound that resembles it. Neither can the sense of smell perceive a perfume so sweet as he, neither can the taste detect a favor so sublime and delectable, neither can the touch feel a movement so delicate and full of delight, nor aught to like it. Neither can his form or any figure that represents him into the thought of imagination. Even as Isaiah says, "The eye hath not seen him, nor hath ear heard him, neither hath it entered into the heart of man." Isaiah 64:4. It would be, at the least, but vanity is to set the rejoicing of the will upon pleasure caused by any of these apprehensions, and it would be hindering the power of the will from occupying itself with God, and from setting its rejoicing upon him alone. This is the soul cannot perfectly accomplish, except by purging itself and remaining in darkness as to rejoicing of this kind, as also with respect to other things. Nevertheless, it is necessary to understand this doctrine correctly in order not to draw erroneous conclusions. It is not necessary to deprive the senses of their proper objects, but only to avoid placing one's joy and final repose in the sensate pleasure of objects aroused without rising to God through them. Creatures are, in the words of St. John of the Cross, mere crumbs or fragments which fall from the table of God. But if one can see the vestige or trace of God in them, they not only cease to be an obstacle for sanctification, but can be converted into means and instruments for growth and in the spiritual life. The evil of the disorder lies in resting in creatures as if they were our ultimate end, prescinding from the relation to God. But when we enjoy their beauty, or the pleasure that they give, they are thereby led to God. They become excellent aids for our sanctification. St. John of the Cross explains the doctrine as follows. I said advisedly that if the rejoicing of the will were to rest in any of these things, it would be vanity. But when it does not rest in them, but as soon as the will finds pleasure that in that which it sees, hears, and does, soars upward to rejoice in God, so that its pleasure acts as a motive and strengthens it to the rest. This is good. In such a case you need only the said motions not be stunned, but because they cause devotion and prayer, but the soul may profit by them, and indeed should so profit to the end that it may accomplish this holy exercise. For there are souls who are greatly moved by objects of sense to seek God. I wish, therefore, to propose a test whereby it may be seen when these delights of the senses aforementioned are profitable and when they are not. And it is that whenever a person hears music and other things, and sees pleasant things, and is conscious of a sweet perfume, or tastes things that are delicious, or feels soft touches, if his thought and an affection of his will are not once centered upon God, and if that thought of God gives him more pleasure than the movement of sense which causes it, and save for that he finds no pleasure in the said movement, this is a sign that he is receiving benefits therefrom, and that this thing of sense is a help to the spirit. In this way such things may be used, for then such things of sense subserve the end in which the God created and gave them, which he should be better loved and known, became of them. Mortification, or custody of the senses, is necessary even in things that are lawful. But here, as in all else, it is necessary to observe prudence and equilibrium without going to extravagant or ridiculous extremes. Some of the mortifications practiced by the saints are more to be admired than imitated. The two principal means of mortifying the senses are, 1. To deprive them of anything that may produce unlawful pleasure, and eventually to curtail even lawful pleasure as one's circumstance permit or one's spiritual needs require. 2. To practice the positive mortification by means of bodily self-denial. Mortification is necessary for all, especially for beginners until they succeed in dominating their passions. In addition to serving as reparation for past sins, bodily mortifications have two other beneficial uses: immolation of self in imitation of Christ, and a positive contribution to the mystical body by means of the apostolate of suffering. Mortification is necessary for all, especially for beginners until they succeed in dominating their passions. In addition to serving as reparation for past sins, bodily mortifications have two other beneficial uses: immolation of self in imitation of Christ, and a positive contribution to the mystical body by means of the apostolate of suffering. These two functions of suffering pertain to the saints as much as and more than to imperfect souls, for no one is excused from practicing bodily mortification in one form or another. St. Vincent de Paul says, "He who has little regard for bodily mortification, under the pretext that interior mortifications are more perfect, demonstrates very clearly that he is not mortified either interiorly or exteriorly." However, one should proceed prudently and slowly, increasing the exercises of penance as the power of the soul increase, as the interior invitations of grace urge one on more and more. Especially at the beginning, one should avoid any kind of severe bodily penance. It must never be harmful to one's health or to make one incapable of fulfilling the duties of state, which are more important than the voluntary practice of mortification. And the soul should take care not to make an end or goal of that which is only a means, believing that sanctity consists in punishing the body. If the Holy Spirit wishes to lead a soul by way of extraordinary penances, he will inspire the soul to that effect and give the strength necessary to carry it out. Meanwhile, the majority of souls who should practice ordinary bodily mortification by accepting the little crosses of daily life with a spirit of faith and perseverance. This last point is very important. It is better to accept and carry faithfully the little crosses of daily life than to give oneself to occasional periods of great penance, alternated with periods of relaxation. Purification of the internal senses. Of the four internal senses, imagination, memory, and common sense, and the estimative power, the common sense, is controlled and purified by the custody and purification of the external senses. The estimative power is purified, controlled when the imagination is purified and the intellectual judgment exercises its proper function. Therefore, we shall speak only of purification of the imagination and memory. The imagination. Every idea acquired by the natural operation of our faculties corresponds to an image impressed upon the imagination. Without images, the intellect cannot know naturally. Our Lord frequently made use of the imagination to place the great mysteries within the grasp of the people by means of his beautiful parables and allegories. The imagination also has a great influence over the sensitive appetite, which is moved with great force towards the proper object when the imagination clothes it with special attractiveness. Because of its great importance and influence, the imagination needs a profound purification. When used in the service of the good, it can give incalculable assistance, but there is nothing that can cause greater difficulty on the way to sanctification that an imagination that has broken away from the control of reason, enlightened by faith. There are two principal obstacles caused by an uncontrolled imagination: dissipation, and temptation. Without recollection, an interior life and a life of prayer are impossible, and there is nothing that so impedes recollection as the constancy and dissipation of the imagination. Freed of any restraint, it paints in vivid colors the pleasures sin provide for the concupiscible appetite. It exaggerates the difficulty of the irascible appetite will encounter on the road to virtue, thus leading to discouragement. But the difficulties can be avoided if we use the proper means. Custody of external senses. It is necessary to control the external senses, and especially the sense of sight, because they provide the images the imagination retains, reproduces, and reassembles, thus arousing the passion and encouraging the consent of the will. There is no better way to avoid temptations from the source than to deprive the imagination of such images by custody of the external senses. Prudent selection of reading matter. It is not only a question of reading matter that is evil or obviously dangerous, but also that which fills the imagination with useless images. There are occasions, of course, when it is beneficial to engage in light reading for relaxation. It is, in fact, a good practice to relieve tension or to rest one's mental powers in this way. But it is likewise necessary to provide holy and profitable material so that the imagination will be directed positively to the good. This is where spiritual reading can contribute a great deal to the proper use of the imagination. Attention to the duty of the moment. The habit of attending to the duty of the moment has the double advantage of concentrating our intellectual powers and of disciplining the imagination by preventing it from being distracted to other objects. It also helps a person avoid idleness, which is one of the primary sources of dissipation. Indifference to distractions. There is no sure way of avoiding all distractions, but one can always ignore them. Indeed, it is a much more effective measure than to combat them directly. One should take no account of them, but should do what one must do, in spite of the uncontrolled imagination. It is possible to keep one's mind and heart fixed on God, even in the midst of involuntary distractions. The memory. We make a distinction between the sense memory, which has for its object only the sensible, the particular, and the concrete, and the intellectual memory, which deals with the supersensible, the abstract, and the universal. But the process of purification is the same. Memory can give inestimable service to the intellect and can be its own powerful ally. Without it, our spirit would be like a sieve that is always empty, however much water is poured into it. For certain types of knowledge, such as languages, history, the physical and natural sciences, an excellent memory is indispensable. Precisely because the memory stores up all kinds of knowledge, both good and evil, it is necessary to subject it to purification. Throughout life we experience many things that are of no use whatever to the sanctification of a soul. Many of them destroy the soul's peace and tranquility, which are so necessary for a life of prayer and recollection. We can offer some suggestions for the active purgation of this faculty. Forget past sins. This is the first step, and it is absolutely indispensable for all who aspire to eternal salvation. The remembrance of one's own sins, or of those of another, has a strong power for suggesting to the soul the same things by way of new temptation, and of disposing it to sin again, especially if a vivid imagination is associated with this kind of recollection. The soul must reject immediately and energetically any remembrance of this kind. Cease thinking of past injuries. This pertains to virtue and is indispensable for any soul that wishes to sanctify itself. In spite of a pardon that has been given, the remembrance of a past offense will disturb the peace of consciousness and present the guilty party in an unfavorable light. One should forget the disagreeable episode and realize that our offenses against God are much greater, and that he demands that we pardon others in order to receive his pardon. The soul that nourishes rancor, however justifiable it may seem, and never is in the eyes of God, can forget about reaching sanctity. Remember benefits from God. This pertains to the positive purgation of the memory and is an effective means for directing the memory to God. The recollection of the immense benefits we have received from God, of the times he has pardoned our faults, of the danger from which he has preserved us, of the loving care that he has exercised over us, is an excellent means of arousing our gratitude towards him and the desire of corresponding more faithfully with his graces. And if to this we add the recollection of the disobedience and rebellion, of our ingratitude and resistance to grace, our soul will be filled with humility and confusion, and will experience the need for redoubling its vigilance and its effort to be better in the future. Consider motives for Christian hope. This is one of the most efficacious means for directing our memory to God and for purifying it of contact with earthly things. St. John of the Cross makes the memory the seat of Christian hope, and shows how growth in this virtue effectively purges the memory. The remembrance of an eternity of happiness, which is the central object of Christian hope, is most apt for making us disdain the things of earth and raise our spirits to God. Purifications of the passions. The sensitive appetite is the organic faculty through which we seek the good so far as it is known through the senses. It is generically distinct from the rational appetite or the will, which seeks the good as apprehended by the intellect. Hence St. Paul says, "The flesh lusts against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh. The two are directly opposed." The sensitive appetite is also called sensuality, is divided into two species, the concupiscible or pleasure appetite, and the irascible or utility appetite. The former has its object the delightful good that is easy to obtain. The latter has its object the arduous good that is difficult to obtain. These two movements to the sensitive appetite give rise to the passions. The passions are movements or energies we can use for good or for evil, but in themselves they are neither good nor evil. When placed in the service of the good, the passions can be of incalculable assistance. even to the point that one could say that it is morally impossible for a soul to arrive at great sanctity without possessing a great energy or passion directed to God. But when placed at the service of evil, the passions are converted into a destructive force that is truly terrifying. As movements of the sensitive appetite, caused by the apprehension of good or evil, our passions are accompanied by a certain change, more or less intense, in the organism. Some psychologists use the word of passion to designate the more vehement and intense movements of the sensitive appetite, reserving the word emotion for those movements that are gentler and more ordinary. In any case, the passion always presupposes some knowledge of the good that is sought or the evil that is feared, and the judgment makes its way in terms of self. The passions are by nature expressions of love of self. In the concupiscible appetite, the good, which has a power of attraction, engenders three movements of passion. The simple awareness of good arouses love. If it is a question of a future good, it gives rise to desire. If it is a good already possessed and present, it produces pleasure. On the other hand, the apprehension of evil, which is of itself repulsive, produces hatred. If it is an impending evil, it causes a movement of flight or aversion. But if the evil has overtaken us, it is called sadness. In the irascible appetite, the absent good, if it is considered possible of attainment, engenders hope. But if it is impossible of attainment, it produces despair. In like manner, the difficult evil that is absent, if it can be avoided, produces courage. But if the evil is unavoidable, it arouses fear. Lastly, the presence of a difficult evil produces anger in the irascible appetites, the sadness in the concupiscible appetites, while the presence of a difficult good does not arouse any movement in the irascible appetite, because joy in the concupiscible appetite. For that reason the irascible appetite has only 5 passions, while there are 6 passions in the concupiscible appetite. The great importance of the passions can be deduced from their decisive influence in our physical, intellectual, and moral life. Without the previous stimulation of the emotions, we would scarcely take one step in our physical life, since the stimulation of the emotions is what enables us to expend an extraordinary amount of effort for good and for evil. Add to this the fact that the passions can have a powerful influence on bodily health, especially the emotions of sadness, anger, or fear. In the moral life, the passions can increase or diminish the goodness and malice, merit or demerit of our actions. They diminish human responsibility when a person seeks a good or evil more because of the impulse of passion than by the free choice of the will. They increase human responsibility when the will confirms the antecedent movement of passion and uses it in order to work with greater intensity. A prudent organization of all our psychological resources can result in near perfect control of our passions, excepting, of course, the first spontaneous movements of passion, but these do not affect morality. People who have lived for years under the domination or disorderly passions have been free to free themselves from this slavery and to begin to live a life that is in harmony with the moral law. There is no doubt that there are great difficulties at the beginning, but gradually the individual can achieve self-mastery. The following principles can be helpful in achieving control and proper use of the passions. 1. Every idea tends to produce its corresponding act. This is especially true if the idea or sentiment is accompanied by strong emotions and a vivid representation. Consequently, it is necessary to formulate ideas that are in accordance with Christian morality and carefully to avoid the concepts and ideas that relate to actions that should be rejected. In this way, one's action will always be in accordance with one's ideas and values. 2. Every act arouses the sentiment of which it is a normal expression. The rule of conduct following from this principle is that in order to acquire the desired sentiment or to intensify the emotions already experienced, one should act as if already experiencing it. In this way, one's sentiments and emotions are controlled by one's actions. 3. Passion augments and intensifies the psychological forces of the individual and uses them for attaining the goal that one seeks. Consequently, it is necessary to choose the emotion carefully in order to gain the most from its psychological potential. In this way, one's ideas and actions are effectively promoted by the correct use of emotional energy. Such are the basic principles concerning the control of use of a passion, but we must now make some detailed applications regarding the rule of conduct in relation to Christian living. First of all, one must be firmly convinced of the need to combat disorderly passions, for these disturb our spirit, impede prayer and reflection, prejudice our judgment, stimulate the imagination, weaken the power of the will, and disturb one's conscience. The remedies, of course, will vary with the particular emotion that must be controlled. Against the passions aroused by one's environment, a good remedy is wholesome recreation, distraction, or a journey. Again, those that proceed from the organism itself, work, custody of the senses and the imagination, and a regular schedule are helpful. Against those originating from one's temperament, the best remedy is reflection and willpower. From a psychological point of view, the most important requisite for controlling the passions is a firm and resolute will to do so. But wishful thinking will not suffice. There must be a determined resolution translated into the effective action, especially if it questions of a deeply rooted disorder on the emotional level. Hence, it is necessary to avoid these situations that arouse the emotions in relation to sinful objects. To prevent any new manifestation of the emotions, and to realize that although giving in to the passion may quiet the urge temporarily, it also gives the passion greater strength for making future demands. Lastly, One should make use of the technique for sublimation or transference, whereby one is able to direct the energy of the passion to morally good and beneficial objects. St. Augustine touched on this when he stated that one should choose wisely the objects of love, and then love with all one's heart. The same thing applies to all the passions. They are powers for good and should be utilized as such, but they can promote one's spiritual perfection and human fulfillment only if directed to the proper objects. Spiritual directors should carefully examine the passion or passions that predominate in the souls under their care. Having done this, they can propose as material for self-examination the control and proper use of passion as we have just indicated. They should concentrate principally on control of the dominant passion, but without neglecting the others, for frequently more than one passion will be involved. The persons receiving direction should faithfully and honestly report to the director regarding progress or failure in this struggle, and they should not be content until they have successfully directed their emotional energies to God into morally good objects. This is no easy task, and for many persons it is the work of a lifetime. On the other hand, it is precisely because they have given up the battle against their own passions that many persons abandon the struggle for sanctity. Lastly, we would stress that we are not here advocating the extinction or repression of the emotions, but their control and proper use, for without great passion for God and the good, sanctity is possible. Purification of the intellect. The active purification of the external and internal senses and of the sensitive appetites constitutes a great step towards Christian perfection. But it is necessary that the purification will reach the very depths of one's spirit, there to rectify the deviations of intellect and will. After that, the passive purifications will complete what a person cannot accomplish by his or her own efforts under ordinary grace. According to traditional psychology, there are two spiritual faculties of the soul, the intellect and the will. Some mystical authors, including St. John of the Cross, considered the intellectual memory as a faculty distinct from the intellect and will. But modern psychology classifies it as a function of the intellect. We shall therefore speak of the active purgation of the two spiritual factories that are really distinct, the intellect and the will. The intellect of the spiritual faculty by which we apprehend things in a non-material way, its proper effect is the idea or essence it abstracts from external reality by means of the abstractive power of the intellect acting upon the phantasm of the imagination. Intellectual knowledge is completely distinct and far superior to sense knowledge. Knowledge acquired through the senses always refer to singular objects in the existential order, but nowhere through ideas or concepts is always universal, abstract, and undetermined as to individuality. We possess sensitive knowledge in common with animals. We possess intellectual knowledge in common with purely spiritual beings. When the intellect compares two ideas and affirms or denies the connection between them, it pronounces a judgment, which is the second act or function of the intellect. When it compares two judgments or statements and draws a conclusion, it performs the act of reasoning. The function proper to the intellect is judgment, and it is there we speak of truth or error. But prior to that, it is necessary that one's exercise proper attention and concentration, so that the concepts received by the intellect will be in conformity with objective truth. Although the intellect as a spiritual faculty is eminently simple, mystical authors have made distinctions or divisions of that faculty in order to explain certain phenomena of mystical experience otherwise difficult to understand. Thus, some of them have referred to the mens, or high point, of the intellect to designate that part of the soul that always reflects the image of God and can experience the divine even in the midst of trials and darkness. They also speak of the superior reason and the inferior reason. The former reaches its conclusions from the principles of pure understanding, unaffected by the passion or lower powers of the soul, whereas the latter tend towards that which is useful or delightful, and is therefore much more closely related to the movements of passion, or what is called animal man. What this means in practice is that the intellectual functions of simple apprehension, judgment, and reasoning can be greatly influenced by the appetitive powers of will and emotions. The latter tend to draw the intellect downward to things of the senses, or inward to selfish pursuits. For this reason, the mystical writers have consistently extolled the speculative and contemplative aspects of the intellectual activity. The active purification of the intellect normally requires, first of all, the removal of obstacles to the virtuous use of this faculty. This means that the individual must at the outset reject all vain, useless, and sinful thoughts. The imagination, as we have seen, is practically uncontrollable directly, and therefore it will frequently present to the intellect phantasms that must be rejected or ignored. Secondly, it is necessary to overcome ignorance by studying the truths of faith and seeking to probe their deeper meaning and their application to Christian living. At the same time, one should avoid the vice of intellectual curiosity that engages in the study of sacred truths as a purely scholastic pursuit, instead of seeing them as truths by which one lives. Lastly, it is necessary to avoid excessive attachment to one's ideas and opinions, especially in matters of faith. The two attitudes that are especially important here are obedience to the magisterium of the Church and the cultivation of a mentality that is open, receptive to new developments, and applications of revealed truths or theological conclusion. We can offer the following positive example as a guide in the purification of the intellect. The soul must let itself be led by the light of faith, which is the proximate and proportionate means for the union of the intellect with God in his life. No one has expounded this principle so well as St. John of the Cross. He repeats it constantly in his ascent to Mount Carmel. Among all creatures, the highest or the lowest, there is none that comes near to God or bears any resemblance to his being, For although it is true, as theologians say, that all creatures have a certain relation to God and bear a divine impress, some more, others less, according to greater or lesser excellence of their nature, there is no essential resemblance or connection between them and God. On the contrary, the distance between their being and his divine being is infinite. Hence it is impossible for the intellect to gain to God by means of creatures, whether these be celestial or earthly, because there is no proportion or resemblance between them. The reason for this is that the imagination cannot fashion or imagine anything whatever beyond that which it has experienced through the external senses, namely, that which it has seen with the eyes, heard with the ears, etc. At most it can only compose likenesses of those things which it has seen or heard or felt. Just so that the imagination can imagine and the intellect can receive and understand in this life, nor can it be a proximate means of union with God. From what has been said is to be inferred that, in order that the intellect be prepared for this divine union, it must be pure and void of all that pertains to sense, detached and freed from all things that can be clearly apprehended by the intellect, profoundly hushed and put to silence, and leaning upon faith, which alone is the proximate and proportionate means whereas the soul is united with God. Therefore, the greater faith of the soul, the more united it is, the more closely it is united with God. Therefore, the soul must travel in pure faith if it wishes to arrive at the perfect purification of the intellect and be intimately united with God. The reason is that, since the rational creature has far greater dignity and excellence than all temporal and earthly creatures, it is made impure by attaching itself to these things through love, but purified by tending those above itself, especially to God. But the first movement towards God is through faith, and therefore the first principal purification is faith, vivified by charity. It does not matter that faith is essentially about things that are not seen clearly and is therefore necessarily obscured. In fact, it is precisely because of this that faith can provide the only knowledge possible concerning the intimate life of God. The clear vision and knowledge of God are reserved for us in the beatific vision and glory, but even in this life, faith enables us to attach by some measure to the unfathomable mystery of God, though the knowledge be dark and obscure. By reason of its object, the knowledge of faith is superior to all sensible and intellectual evidence that we could have of God in this life. It is necessary that the soul inform all its life and actions with the light of faith, and cling ever more firmly to the truths proposed for faith on the authority of God. Gradually, one can reach the point of judging all things through the light of faith, and, indeed, to see all things as God sees them.